now tuned in to the Same Table podcast. I am your host, Matthew Thomas, and I'm joined with my co-host, Deb Wong. Deb, how are you doing today?
Good. I'm doing well. How about you, Matthew?
I'm doing pretty good. You know, me and my family have been navigating this COVID reality, and so that's been challenging. And also, when we record this episode, is March break in Nova Scotia and the Halifax, I guess all the school districts, I'm assuming, in Nova Scotia. So it's an interesting week, but I'm excited to be here at the same table with you, Deb. And also, we have a really special guest that we're super excited about. Let's welcome to the same table today, Mr. Dr. Danny Zacharias. Danny, how are you doing today, brother?
Doing great. So happy to be here. Excited to be on this podcast, and great follow-up with your church community. And the first episode that I listened to with Lennett, it's really hard to top Lennett, but I'll try my best.
Yeah, he is a hard person to one up, because he's just a unique brother. Let's just say that. But no, we're super pumped.
I learned a lot.
Yeah, for sure, and we're hoping that that folks will journey and learn from our episode today. And just for those of you maybe tuning in for the first time, the whole concept of the Same Table podcast is that we can bring people with different perspectives, different experiences around the same table, which is Jesus Christ. And in an attempt to help us as a church learn to be and to represent that multi-ethnic image of what the church is to be, and to celebrate that and to honor that and to live that out faithfully. And so that's the whole point and purpose of this podcast. And we're hoping that our conversation today will kind of lead us in that direction. And so, Danny, people might not know who you are. I know who you are really well. But why don't you just kind of give us a little intro? Who is Danny Zacharias?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm the Associate Professor of New Testament at Acadia University. That's how I came to know you. So I'm at the Divinity College. I've been here for quite a while. I first came as a student in 2003. And then once I was done, started teaching. But of course, before all that, I grew up in Winnipeg. And that's what we would call Treaty 1 territory in Canada. So it falls under the first of the number of treaties, the largest treaty. And so grew up in Winnipeg all my life, right on the better part of the North End. And if you're ever from Winnipeg, you know that the North End is the rough area of town. And I was in the better of the rough area in town. And live here now in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. So I've lived in the valley ever since we moved here. And I have my wife, Maria, and 4 kids, 2 cats. And what else do you want to know about me? That's me in a nutshell.
That's good. Danny, how long have you been teaching at Acadia?
So I graduated I always have to look up at my degree sitting on the wall here to remember. I'm getting old and forget. So I graduated in 2007 with my Master of Arts and started teaching part-time, as well as doing some technology stuff for the college, and started working on my PhD part-time. And the role slowly morphed to be more than part-time, and then full-time, and then became a lecturer, and then a assistant professor, and then associate professor. And yeah, that's me. So it's been quite a journey with the college, from student to professor, and it's been awesome. It's a great place. It's very much my home, not only work wise, but community wise.
Yeah.
And it's just a great place.
That's awesome, man. Well, speaking of kind of your ethnic journey, who you are ethnically, but also as a follower of Jesus, can you kind of share a little bit about what that journey has been like as a Christian, but also as an Indigenous person in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's been quite a journey, and like a long time coming, because it wasn't something that I necessarily grew up with. So I think about being here in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, which for much longer has been called Mi'kma'ki. And it's an ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And And so I try to remind myself of that. I try to remind others of that when I'm speaking. This place has been known by a different name for much longer, and has been known by different people for much longer, who are still here and who still know these lands. And it's okay that it has two names, as long as we don't forget the first one.
Yeah.
And when I think about that in relation to where I am, because I'm not Mi'kmaq. My maternal ancestors are Korean and Anishinaabe, and that's in the area of Manitoba, kind of lower central and even up north in Manitoba. So a place called Norway House, which is quite high up in Manitoba. And so, thinking back to, how I've kind of come along this path and this journey, I didn't really grow up with that. Like most Indigenous Canadians, you have this, or you have had this sense and this push of assimilation in Canadian society for so long. And so it wasn't necessarily something to be proud of. It's something you often had to fight for.
Yeah.
And at times, for many of us, it was something that you actually would actively suppress. So, both my Indigenous heritage, like I said, coming from my maternal side, that's the same family from which I have my Christian heritage as well. So my grandmother and grandfather, who I dearly love, who've passed on to the next journey in their life, they were very devout Christians. It's, back in the days when church was 4 or 5 nights a week, they were there 4 or 5 nights a week with all of my aunts and uncles. And yet, despite that, they faced this discrimination in Winnipeg because they were the dark-skinned Indians on the block. And my mom, grew up with that racism in her community that they faced. And yet they're the devout church-going family on the block at the same time, right? So they're facing these realities. And, understandably, because this was very much the norm at that time, and in some cases in the church still is the norm, that your Christian heritage kicks out any other affiliation. It becomes the prime, and that it's not that that's bad, right? Jesus is Lord and He's central, but that became combative rather than inclusive, right? And so Indigenous Christians who found themselves to be followers of Jesus, devout churchgoers, there was quite oftentimes this kind of self-suppression of your heritage, right? And so there'd be people within my family, wider family, that, that's not something that you would celebrate being Indigenous, right? It's something like if it came up, then it came up briefly. It wasn't a cultural practice for us. The Christian identity was primary.
Yeah.
And so, my own journey of starting to ask these questions of saying, well, what did we lose as a family in our heritage because of this, both societal and political assimilationist policies, but also because of Christian teaching, that said that those things are bad. Those are things that you give up, right? Or they're actually evil, right? Because that was the type of language that would be used when you talked about Indigenous culture. What did we lose as a family? What have I lost because those things were passed on to me? And so really it's only been in the last, less than a decade really that I've started to ask those types of questions and deal with them and struggle with them in earnest. And it's difficult, and I'm not unique in this. I would say most people my age who are Indigenous who you meet are largely in the same category of seeking to re-identify with their cultural heritage, and sometimes having to piece together because it wasn't passed along, and now those people who may have known are no longer with us. And they were, at their time, my great grandfather didn't speak anything but English, right? Because that would be looked down upon by everyone else, right? And so it wasn't passed on. And, I've learned things about some of my ancestors that I never knew because, again, it was kept hush hush because it would be, they would be discriminated against. There was this fear because there's Indian agents around, there's RCMP around, there's different political agents around, and they saw what was going on. Luckily, due to circumstances, my family weren't the targets for residential schooling, but it was happening around some of my ancestors, right? So you had to lay low and you would suppress all of those things. And so, inevitably that means that I received very little. And I'm piecing together as best I can those understandings to like you said, try and say, what does it mean for me to be an Indigenous follower of Jesus? How do I bring these two together in a beautiful way?
I'm wondering, Danny.
One of the.
Oh, I was going to ask Danny a follow-up question because I'm just curious about where do you go? Is it family only? Like, where do you go to engage with some of those pieces? Because I just wonder about sometimes it's everyone's look into their past can be hard because sometimes it's also like, what do your kind of like generations above you, what do they feel open to talk about too, and how much trauma exists in those situations? So what has it been like for you? What are the pieces? Where do you go for those pieces?
Yeah, so it's a bit of different things. It's sometimes just learning about the culture, through people that I don't actually know, like through books or lectures or podcasts, those types of things. It's especially when I can, connecting with family members, those who are left, those who are, aren't necessarily, trying to re-embrace or relearn about their cultural heritage, but still remember some things about it. Some things about, great grandfather or great grandmother, so learning some of those things, and then learning about the history, of Manitoba, of Treaty 1, of those areas. So it's a bit of a combination of those things. And I think especially for me, what really sparked this was first meeting Terry LeBlanc. So he's the director for Indigenous Pathways, which is also that's kind of like the overarching ministry for NAIITS, Indigenous Learning Community, as well as something called iEmergence, which is more focused at youth and community development. So it's when I first met him and saw, so there's someone who celebrates and practices his cultural heritage and is a proud Jesus follower, right? And so that kind of sparked in me this desire to start thinking more about that. What does that mean? What does that look like? So it's a bit piecemeal, and I try to be careful with that because, not be careful, I try to remember that not every First Nation in Canada has the same traditions, right? Each one is unique. That's why they're called First Nations. So there is a bit of a kind of a pan-Indigenous experience. Really, there's a bit of a global Indigenous experience, but you can't just bring all of that and say that's what my culture was like, that this is what the Cree were like, or this is what the Anishinaabe were like. That's not the case. So it's a little bit piecemeal in a sense, right? In trying to bring it back together. And in some cases for First Nations in Canada, they recognize there are things that are just lost, period, for us. And so we try as best we can to reconnect with our heritage, with our past, with our ancestors, and we build from that soil, we build new traditions and bring those things together. So,
Danny, I'm coming back to you. Another question that I have. We were in a preaching series back in November called Reconciled, and that series kind of has framed the first season of this podcast, where we've been talking about messy reconciliation, how trying to live out faithfully being reconciled not only to God but to one another, especially around cultural differences, can sometimes be messy. And so this season we want to address the mess. And so how has reconciliation felt messy in your experience?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, messy can be beautiful at the same time, right? And I think we need to remember that. And relationships are always messy too. At the moment that they're, when you get to the point where they're not messy, it may be that they're starting to get a little fake. So in terms of, when we think about reconciliation and the mess of it, in particular in this context of reconciliation, Indigenous and Canadian reconciliation, I think part of the messiness is it's so entangled with so many other things, right? It's both relational, it's political, it's historical, it's economic, it's spiritual, so you have these interconnected things. And we don't always like that. Sometimes we like these nice fit categories, right? And so, okay, we've got we've made the historical reconciliation, even though I don't think we have, but we want to tackle it in one space, not realizing it's so interconnected with other spots as well. So I just think we have to, like you said, embrace that, recognize that, and recognize that life is messy. And so when we come to reconciliation, all of these things are going to be deeply connected because of the historical roots of it and because it's had such a long lifespan.
Yeah, that's good. One of the criticisms against kind of, I know that there was a movement, probably would have been in the early to mid 2000s, particularly in the States, kind of towards racial reconciliation within the church, also kind of birthed this wave of an emphasis on multi-ethnic churches. And one of the criticisms of this type of gospel focus is that it can seem and feel disingenuous or a lot of platitudes because you have, together when we're in the context of a church or a Sunday, you have this, diversity or celebration or we're one in Jesus, but then you go in societies and there's injustice, there's systemic racism, there's things that reveal that, and within a societal context, there's a lot of disparities of how different groups of people are treated. And so to help us kind of understand, both justice and reconciliation, because one of the things that is often required in reconciliation is justice, to act justly, to see not only the relational or interpersonal connections repaired, but the societal issues addressed and challenged, so that we not only are just people, but we live in just societies. And so can you kind of describe the relationship between justice and this idea of racial reconciliation, how those things interact?
Yeah. Well, where there's racial and ethnic, evils and injustices that have been perpetrated or continue to be perpetrated, I don't see any way that justice can exist when those are there. And when it's happened historically, again, if those issues are not addressed and redressed, I don't know how you can speak meaningfully about justice, right? I was just listening to a podcast earlier today, and it was talking about how, the brilliance of Jesus being able to sum everything down to love God, love your neighbor, right? Or the golden rule, like treat others how you want to be treated. Can you imagine if all of our systems and all of our relationships built off of those core teachings of Jesus, right? Out of which everything flows, which is what he was saying, right? He's summing up, if you're to sum up the whole Testament, it's this, right? If you're to sum up justice and reconciliation, it's that. How are you going to treat your neighbor the way you want to be treated? How are you going to show love of neighbor in that way? So, yeah, those things, I don't see how those can be split apart, like you just said, right? How could you talk about reconciliation if after the meeting, like you said, of a multi-ethnic meeting, if you go away and that injustice perpetuates outside the walls or inside the walls, if the leadership's table is still all white men, In what way can you actually speak meaningfully about reconciliation and justice going forth?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great word. And kind of, building off that last question, one of the justice issues that impacts reconciliation in our day is racial injustice, which I'm sure you know a lot about and can speak into, but particularly systemic racism. And I think sometimes this is a issue I see and have experienced both pastoring people, talking with people, and even my own journey of where there's just a lot of misunderstanding or tension that exists. I think people can understand kind of individual racism or direct racism. If someone calls me the N-word or makes a comment to you or to all of us, I'm sure we've all had racial insults and slurs and both directly and indirectly. So I think people can get their head around the idea of kind of personal acts of prejudice or discrimination. But this idea of systems or institutional racism and disparities and how that exists, could you just kind of help us understand, how would you define systemic racism, and how has that particularly impacted the Indigenous community here in Canada?
Yeah, that's a small question.
Good luck.
Here we go. Okay, digging into it here. Oh my goodness. So I'll swing her. I'm going to start at the Indigenous issue, and I'm going to swing back to it at the end, because I don't understand today how any Canadian, and I'm speaking from the Canadian context specifically, but I could probably broadly say any colonial country, any country that has been or had been colonized. I don't see how you can deny systemic racism. And in particular in Canada today, I don't understand how people can deny systemic racism when you have ongoing treaty violations in Canada. You have ongoing unceded territory that is yet called Crown land. And you have the Indian Act, which is, one of the main legislations of the federal government of Canada, that is still in effect. And despite the fact that it's had, amendments and things like that, there's been calls to abolish the Indian Act on both sides for many years. But on the one side, so you go back to back in the days of the first Trudeau under Jean Chrétien, who was not the prime minister at the time, but pushed the white paper, and that was an attempt essentially to dissolve the Indian Act, but by so doing also dissolves most of the treaty obligations. And then on the other side, with Indigenous people saying, yeah, we need to abolish the Indian Act, but it's not because we want to be treated exactly the same. It's because we've made agreements under treaties with the government that's what should be upheld in these different territories, right? So there's this agreement, but for one, it's because we want to get rid of the problem of the fact that you have treaties with various people, which means certain things regarding this land that we're in. And on the other side saying, well, it's because this is a racist document. And yet it's still, it is still in play. It is the document through which all of Indigenous relations in Canada flows through. And so to talk about the fact that there's no such thing as systemic racism in which you have a country with one of the main legislative components called the Indian Act, is nonsensical to me. So now let's pause and say, well, what is systemic racism anyway, right? So you have, in my opinion, two components to this. You have, first off, the traditional understanding of systemic racism as being policies that actually discriminate against certain peoples, right? So that certainly is the case in Canada with the Indian Act. But I would say that you also have, in my opinion, as I come to this discussion as a Christian, I think about the fact that I don't see the world as a place devoid of spiritual powers. And so when I think about racism, if I were to just generalize it to sin, is there such thing as systemic sin, like an ethos within societies and communities that bend us and predispose us to not love our neighbor, right? To violate the needs of others, right? Those things, I would think, in a Christian worldview would be like, of course, of course, there are those things. And so why is it so hard for us to admit to a systemic racism if we take both of those things in check, that there are sometimes hard political issues, like it's written down somewhere, like redlining and Jim Crow in the States, right? Or the Indian Act, but also these spiritual realities where spiritual forces affect communities and thoughts and processes. And the rejoinder to this, as you know, as we've all heard, is there's no such thing as systemic racism. There's just individual racists. And again, I can't understand. Well, I understand it. I just don't firmly disagree with it because we have been taught in the Western church, especially, of this overriding individualism in our society.
Yeah, that's good. That's right.
That it's always the individual.
Yeah.
And that's for both sin and virtue. Yeah. It's always individualistic, these individualistic categories. But that's not how the Bible talks about sin.
Yeah.
It does talk about sin that way, but it doesn't only talk about sin that way. When you get into the book of Romans, for instance, Romans talks about sin as an oppressive power, right? It's not just an individual act. And, you know, a good example that I was just thinking of as I was preparing for our discussion, because I'm doing a commentary, several different commentaries on the book of Matthew, and I've been looking at the baptism. And you think about the baptism of Jesus, where he comes to be baptized, and what's the preaching of John the Baptizer? It's for the remission of sins, right? And an individualistic mindset looks at that and says, well, what does he have to repent of? He's the sinless Son of God. But it's because Jesus wasn't coming to it with an individualistic mindset. He was joining in with the repentance of a people and the renewal movement of a people together, right? And in fact saying, I'm going to lead this now, right? I'm going to lead this and show us how this can be a renewal movement for our people, and then ultimately for all the world. So he wasn't just thinking we're each individually repenting of our sin, but rather we are corporately doing something together. And so it's not just individualistic. And so, again, as we circle back to systemic racism in the church, I just don't see how we can choose to deny that when we see in our scriptures that sin is corporate. It's corporate and it's individual, right? And so to say it's not, if your worldview is individualistic, I can understand why you get there. My problem is that worldview is wrong. It's not biblical. Right? It is individualistic, but it's also system-wide. It's also spiritual powers and places that we're fighting against, right? We're supposed to be soldiers against those things, right? That's that putting on of the armor in Galatians, fighting these spiritual forces, not denying that they're even there.
Oh, that's so good, Danny. Actually, one of my mentors, he was sharing with me. I didn't read this myself, but he was referring to a commentary on that Ephesians 6 passage when Paul is putting on the full armor, and that the context in which he's sharing those words and writing those words, the resistance that he is experiencing is for the sake of Gentile inclusion. And so the very nature of trying to be, have unity within our diversity and pursuing that collective oneness in Christ is a contentious thing, and it always has been. And I think that speaks to that spiritual collective reality that you're referring to, that the very very kind of proof text we have for spiritual warfare is in the context of dealing with discrimination or issues of prejudgment or excluding people on the basis of culture or ethnicity, which I find extremely interesting.
Another great example of that is in the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, you have you have this weird travel narrative at the end of Acts, right? So you have all this, these huge events happening that are like really cemented in our minds for early church history. And then Paul goes on a ship tour, right? You have this travel to Rome. And one of the awesome things about that story is it's this breakdown of categories, because as they land on the island and they're going to starve if they don't get help, it's the indigenous islanders who help them out.
Yeah.
And in Greek, it's the barbaros, it's the barbarians, right? So this was like the lowest of the low category. It's the people that we can't control, like the Roman Empire, and yet they're hosting them and they're taking care of them and they're treating Paul with this due respect, right? So it's fighting against the categories, right? The gospel is breaking down these categories of people where they've labeled them as barbarians, as savage, and yet they're paradoxically accepting or receiving this new divine messenger, this Paul, right? So it's like you said, again, it's that breaking down of categories. It's not just individuals.
That's right. That's good.
Wow.
That's a good word.
I mean, I think you mentioned it, Danny, when you were talking about systemic racism and how we individualize it, especially in the evangelical Western church. And so the systemic racism piece has and is a contentious topic within our church, like our church today, and probably for a while. So like nothing is really new under the sun, I think. And I think you mentioned in your sermon last year that very few evangelical churches are willing to engage in this area, maybe because of the political arena nature of it, especially as it relates to Indigenous issues. And so I was just wondering, why do you think our kind of resistance or reluctance to engage, why do you think that is? And I think you touched on it a little bit. I'm curious, systemic racism, what's like at the root of it? Maybe that's like a symptom, but what's at the root of it? I'm curious. Yeah. What would you say?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up root, right? Because that's a metaphor that I so often go to. What is the root of these things? And if you recall, for those of you who listened to the sermon at Deepwater, I talked about that you can have these things grow up out of your faith, and it looks one way, and then you need to say, well, why does it look that way? It's because the soil that it was planted in created it, right? That's the soil that it's in. And so if we have something that's grown up, or if we have something like denial of systemic racism, again, to me, that means that there's something in your theology and worldview that causes you to deny that, right? And you need to say, am I willing to go back to my soil and say, is that right? Right? Or is there something there that has diseased, do I have a bad root in there?
Yeah.
And it's grown into something new. So again, you think back to the individualism, if that's our understanding of salvation, that it's purely individualistic, and it's about my own morality, then what grows out of that is something like denial of corporate expressions of things, denial of corporate manifestation of evil and sin. It's always just about the individual, right? So these things are growing up out of our own theology and worldview. That's why we have to constantly be going back to the scripture and saying, is what I believe correct, right? And then how is what I believe, or how is my worldview being reinforced by what I do? Because these things are mutually reinforcing, right? And sometimes we have to break the cycle, and it has to be at both sides. I need to force myself to do something. I need to force myself to say something in a new way in order to try and start changing the gears, right? In order to try and dig out that root from the bad soil in the first place. I was thinking about a while back, probably over a decade ago now, there's a sociologist named Christian Smith, and he talked about how, now he was talking about America, but I would say it's applicable to the Western world. He talked about how he saw Christianity as a moral therapeutic deism. And so that's how he was defining it. He's saying, like, most people at that time, as far as he can tell as a sociologist, they believed ultimately that there was a God, but that he was relatively distant from people's lives. That people were supposed to be good, that was the morality. That the purpose of life ultimately was to be happy and feel good about oneself. Again, there's that individualism, right? That there's no moral truths, ultimate absolute truths. That God is about allowing good people into heaven. Again, so there's that dualism, that heaven and earth. And then God places very limited demands on people ultimately. So he saw this as he, was talking to primarily the emerging generation at the time, my age and, the generation before, and saying, this is really how they think about God and their Christian faith, right? And if that's the case, and if it's still the case, you can see how, again, this denial of systemic realities, right? It's really just about what I personally think on the inside. Do I feel myself to be a good person? If Christianity is just about this individual piety, ultimately, then you can understand why they would want to deny systemic realities, because if there is systemic realities, it means I'm part of it. And I'm either being oppressed by it or I'm actually the oppressor. And I'm participating in those systems. So again, it's going, like you said, it's going back to the root. Is there a diseased root somewhere that I need to dig out? And I have these proclivities as well. So lest I sound overly judgmental, I very much grew up in this, and I would say my denomination still will sometimes lend towards this of staying out of the political arena, right? This separation of church and state, which originated as this means the government doesn't tell us how to do things, that it doesn't mean Canadian equals Anglican or Canadian equals whatever. That has morphed into not being involved, or at least not willing to take stances as often as we should, right? Unless it's these egregious, obvious things, right? But when it comes to making stands regularly, this is where I think where we really we get scared off, and we kind of retreat back to we're not going to be political. We're just going to be Christian, right? My citizenship is only with heaven, not with Canada as well. So we make these divisions, and we're scared to do it. And so that the why do very few evangelicals decide to enter into that political arena? It's our theology, it's our worldview. I think it's also the convenience, or the not convenience, sorry, it's the reality that most evangelical churches, certainly in my area, are predominantly white still. And so the oppressions that are being faced usually aren't being faced by them. And so when it's not affecting them, they may be aware of it. Whether they're willing to stand up and face it,
it's not as real, right? Doesn't feel as real.
No, that's so true. And Danny, just kind of a follow-up question to that. Have you had people directly push back? And I'm talking more I'm sure you probably have people that are in the periphery, but I mean people in your congregation, your community, that have put colleagues that have pushed back against your advocacy or creating awareness around systemic racism? Have you had that direct kind of confrontation? And if you have, can you speak to that? But also, how does that make you feel especially if it's coming from a brother or sister in Christ? Like share a little bit about how that affects you emotionally, especially as we're supposed to be the family of God.
Yeah. I would say I probably, knowing, discussions I've had with you, I don't think it's been as in my face as it has with you at times, Matt. Certainly the discussion about whether racism could be systemic or just individuals, I've had those conversations. And I would say the times that I have had, they've been respectful, not anger, not angry. They have come, as a brother or sister in Christ, and want to discuss, and aren't, feeling attacked. Hopefully I don't make people feel attacked, but nor have they, come at me or anything like that. I would say it probably happens more online than anywhere else. But even then, it hasn't been as bad.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's, for the most part, it's been people asking questions for clarification, which is good, right? It's coming with questions rather than with accusations.
Yeah.
So I'd say I've been fortunate in that regard.
Yeah.
The places where I probably received the most pushback have generally been more in the cultural issues, like the idea that you can fully engage with an Indigenous culture and still be a believer at the same time, that those things can integrate.
Yeah.
Quite often, I think that's where I've had the most pushback, or people thinking that this is compromising to the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's I resonate with some of those tensions. Have you got much pushback from folks in the Indigenous community in terms of embracing Christianity? Because I know in my community as an African Nova Scotian, I always joke in apologetics class at ADC that we're giving arguments for the existence of God, which is helpful, and I learned a lot. But the whole time in class, I'm like, this is not the people I talk to's issue.
Right? Yeah.
They have some concept and belief in God. Might not be the same as mine, but that is not their issue. Their issue is, why does it seem as though Christianity, and to use some of the language that some of my friends have told me, is a white man's religion, is slave religion, is a religion to ensure your subjugation. It's your oppressor's worldview. So why would you subject to yourself to something that, at least historically, since it's been kind of came to the Americas, has been used as a direct tool of your subjugation? Why would you subscribe to that? And so I've had a lot of pushback from Black people who don't get how any Black person would follow Jesus, or probably more so subscribe to Christianity would be a better way to put it.
Yes.
So has there been any of that pushback that you experienced within the Indigenous community?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And that's, I would say that's similar to what you've experienced, in the sense of saying there is this Christendom, right? And to call yourself a Christian is to align with Christendom, which is in bed with colonization, right? And so certainly you'd have that pushback, and you'd have that anger, that you would side with, because as but just in case people who are listening to this don't know, a long period of time, the residential schools were run by the churches. This wasn't just the government. It was the government alone, and then it was the government asked the churches, and the churches were only too happy to do it. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you have the parties to the agreement, which were primarily the large denominations, right? So, and as we've begun to experience the wave of unmarked graves, and this will happen for, I would say, probably 10 to 20 more years, that we'll be hearing about more unmarked graves being found. That understandably will continue to raise those questions of why would you align with an organization who is responsible for those things. And like, it's in somewhat a trite response, and it's repetitive, but it's still very true that I follow Jesus. I don't follow the organization. And I'm just as much against Christendom as this colonizing power wed with power, hegemonic power.
Yeah,
that's right.
I'm just as much against that. But we do need to recognize that in Indigenous circles, for instance, you will find some Indigenous peoples who won't even use the label Christian. They would say, I'm an Indigenous follower of Jesus, if they're a born again believer. But they won't always use the language of Christian. That's not everyone. That's, it's going to be different for certain people.
Yeah.
So you do certainly have that, like that's the colonizer's religion.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this is why it's been so hurtful, I think, in the Catholic circles in Canada, that in the TRC, the only religious institution or religious person that the TRC asked for an apology from was the Pope. They didn't ask anyone else to apologize, any other religious institution. Some religious institutions did, and that was good. And hopefully it was followed up with actions, not just words.
Mm.
But the only apology they asked for was from the Pope, and the Pope still hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, part of the reason that it was asked for is because despite all of this history, you still have Indigenous people who are devout Catholics. And they're continuing to be devout Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the head of their church has refused to offer that apology.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would say, Matt, is that you have the other side within Indigenous realities is you also have Indigenous Christians who would still hold to that old way of thinking that Indigenous culture is evil, is demonic. Mm-hmm. And so when they hear someone like me or others who would embrace and seek to learn about their culture, and like you had me bringing in a hand drum and singing in your church, like that would be something that they would be against still. So you have both sides. You have those who are saying, why would you follow Jesus? Why would you choose to associate with the church? Mm-hmm. And you have others saying, why would you choose to associate with your culture?
Mm-hmm.
You have both of those sides for Indigenous followers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Danny. You were just talking about the diaspora of not just Indigenous people in Canada, but also within Christian faith, or even the view on Christianity. And I think you also touched upon systemic racism in the church, why it's so hard. You talked about the root that it's coming. We have to kind of examine the root. And I was curious about if you have some pastoral words of that process of unrooting some of those things that I think I've seen how unmooring, and I've experienced to some degree how unmooring it is to unroot some of these deep things in my life. And so I'm just curious from your point of view, or pastoral kind of shepherding of people who I think maybe hearing some of these things, confronting some of these things, maybe for the first time, maybe for the 10th time, and feeling a little bit of fear of how do I actually do that?
Yeah. Well, so let me draw a few other analogies. So we're using the agricultural analogy. What you're talking about, I think, is when people, when their worldview or their faith ends up being like a house of cards, right? When something's pulled out and all of a sudden the whole thing crumbles. Yeah. So let's go to another biblical analogy, and that's where Paul talks about Christ being the cornerstone, right? So what's the cornerstone of your faith, right? Is it faith in the resurrected Lord? And if it is, then removing a brick is not going to change the orientation and the structure, right? It just means changing a brick out, right? And taking down the bad stuff, but you still got the cornerstone. And even going back to that agricultural analogy, right? If you pull out a root and the plant is still rooted, then it begins to rely on the roots that are still in the ground more, right? And so if we can pull out those diseased roots and we still have that central root, which should be there already, right? And that's what we lean back into. And that's what it, when we talk about, on my side, from Indigenous followers, when we talk about decolonizing our faith, it's saying, what are those roots that were actually pushed in and came out of colonization practices, or even Christendom, the wedding of the state with religious power. It's taking those things out, not so that your plant it dies, but rather so that it reinvests in the root that it should have been on already, and that's Christ, right? That you're focusing on that cornerstone again as you build your spiritual temple, as it were. And so that decolonizing isn't about destroying your faith or deconstructing your faith. It's actually trying to strengthen your faith where it should be in the first place. So, the reality of a house of cards, crumbling down when something gets pulled out. I mean, it happens all too often, and it's because their trust and their faith wasn't in the right spot. It was built on all these other little things, and that's what that decolonizing process is that many of us are going through, and people like myself and others are trying to get the Canadian church to wake up to. Saying, where are places in your faith and in your church where you have these roots in places that it shouldn't be, right? Or now the wider society is exposing it and saying, those roots of yours are diseased, right? It has resulted in bad things in what you're doing, and we need to renovate that, right? When I hear deconstructing faith, I'm thinking, I like to use renovating, right? I should always be renovating my faith. We should all be doing that, always. Anytime something bad happens, anytime we're challenged, anytime we see destruction and good, and when we see good too, that should be renovating our faith too. We should always be rethinking, right? When we encounter something new in the Word or in the world, those should be causing us to rethink, right? And renovate.
That's right.
Rather than just deconstruct, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that hopeful
good
word, man. That's
that's good. I think when you were saying that, Danny, I was thinking about getting that Romans 12 passage, the renewing of the mind, the renovation of the mind constantly. Yeah. That's really good. And so, Danny, a follow-up question to that. If there was let's say the top 3 resources, information, education that you would direct someone to that can help, unearth things or just give new inputs of information, or if we want to continue the renovation analogy, maybe if it's a piece of information that acts as a sledgehammer, or maybe some new drywall, because we've already knocked it down.
saw, right?
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be so
What if there was 3 tools for this renovation job that people would need that you could kind of highlight? And I know sometimes, trying to make short lists is insufficient, but if you could just direct people 3 things that they could go to help kind of, again, do some good renovation in their journey, what would you say those are?
Yeah, well, I continue to go back to the TRC, and I say this a lot to people, is that, in our circles, for evangelical Protestant churches that were not part of the big Protestant denominations that ran the residential schools, the TRC call to action was for education in the history of Canada, the history of colonization, how the church played part to it, as well as the learning about and learning to respect Indigenous spiritualities in their own right. Doesn't mean that you partake. It doesn't mean that you necessarily place it on the same par as any other spirituality, but you learn and respect it, that the people have a right to that. In Baptist circles, that should not be hard because of our belief in the autonomy of the individual to make choices on how they choose to practice faith. That's kind of the bread and butter of Baptistic tradition, and I speak as a Baptist. So, that education just to our past Canadian history, and I'm really happy to see, at least in my circles, with my kids in the schools that they're in the Valley here, has done really well in this past 5 or 6 years to make that a regular part of education, celebrating, the Truth and Reconciliation Day and Indigenous history, learning about the Mi'kmaq peoples, so a lot of that I think is, those are cultural changes broadly in Canada that we just need to, I think, continue to encourage and see, and hopefully it becomes part of the rhythms of our churches as well. So, that's a big one, just that education piece. And again, just to remind, you guys know that we have a free online course that we put together, and many of your people went through that. And there's many churches and individuals And again, that's a response to the TRC. Another one I would say is just to begin to dial into some of the close communities around you, Indigenous communities, because the reserves are kind of the cultural hub, as it were, of the peoples in the area. Especially in this area, Halifax, you would have Indigenous folks living in the city, and there would be some cultural centers in Halifax where you guys are.
That's right.
Where I am, it's the reserves are kind of the cultural hubs, and so, I make it a point to be dialed into the news that comes out of Mi'kmaq leadership or Glooscap First Nation, as well as Annapolis Valley First Nation, so that when things arise, like if issues arise, if they're fighting with government officials over things or feel that their treaty rights are being violated, I'm alert to it. I'll often, especially if there's like a letter writing campaign, join in with that. So again, it's just becoming aware of the communities around you to know what's happening, what's going on, because again, this is so often the case. We can keep the things in the theoretical without saying, okay, well, how does this actually work out to say I'm going to walk this kind of way of reconciliation? Yeah. So like actually becoming aware and saying, what are places I can actually put my hand to when these issues arise, right? How can I keep myself informed and be a conduit to inform others when these things happen? Yeah. So those would be some suggestions I'd have.
That's good. One question I had, Danny, coming out of the TRC was the invitation to do land acknowledgements. And so I know we as a church, and I've had conversations with other churches, is kind of what does that look like in the context of the local church doing land acknowledgements? And so do you have any wisdom, any insight, just the kind of the heart behind why the Indigenous community makes that request? And also specifically, what are some best practices or just some wisdom that churches should consider when wanting to, maybe take on the assignment or go through the process of doing that and kind of doing it meaningfully? Do you have just some words of wisdom how we as the church can respond to the Indigenous community by way of a practical thing towards reconciliation in the case of land acknowledgements?
Yeah.
What do you got, Danny? Lay it on us.
Yeah. So I would say you would have you can have good ways to do something, and you can have ways where it just becomes ticking off the box.
Yeah.
And I would say if your church is doing it just to tick off a box, don't bother doing it. Yeah. Right? It's going to be it's not only not going to be received well, but it's just going to feel trite and hollow. So, there's times where I've been asked to do a land acknowledgement, and I take the time to try and craft the words, and I take it as a teachable moment to maybe teach something new that people didn't know about the space that they're in. And I was thinking about it in terms of churches, like it's there's some churches, and I don't know if your church does it or has in the past, Matt or Deb, but there were times in the past where once a month your church may have like a missions moment where like they highlight one of the missionaries that you support, right? And that's not trite, because you're actually talking about an actual person who's over there in that place doing that thing, and we're partnering with them, right? Yeah. And so that's not a tick off the box, because you're trying to be intentional about that with your community, and we need to think of it that way, right? Whether it's every week or whether it's once a month, however it happens, that it's being done meaningfully and for a reason, and you're not forgetting what the reason is. And it's, again, to remember that historically speaking, you guys have only been here for a short period of time. And that includes me, by the way. I consider myself a guest in Mi'kmaq because my ancestors are not from this area, right? And so it's an acknowledgement for me too when I do it. I'm not acknowledging my own ancestors. I'm acknowledging the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq people. So it's that kind of genuine reminder instead of going through the motions. And if you feel that as a church you can authentically do that, which means, being very intentional, then do it, right? Because then it's authentic. If you're doing it because you think it's the PC thing to do, don't bother, because people are just going to see right through that.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Danny, because that's kind of the point we're at as a church is we want it to be meaningful and authentic and sincere, and we don't want it to be, a virtue signal or something. I find with a lot of this work, a lot of patience and processing is required, because the education and the knowledge and the awareness really is the beginning to know, the direction you need to go in, or just that you're going down a meaningful journey, like you're feeling it, you're experiencing it. But so often, I know even myself, I want to move to action and move to, let's implement. And also, so many people are at different points in the journey. And that's the other thing. Like, I know sometimes for me, I might be behind some folks or further ahead. So trying to move a collective body towards a direction, I mean, in any context is challenging, but I find with this work, because I think it is ultimately a soul thing. It's a spiritual heart issue. And anytime, when we're dealing with our formation and discipleship, it takes time to kind of get there. And so that you're what you're sharing is very helpful, because we're literally at a place as a church of wanting to go through that process in terms of land acknowledgements meaningfully. Also, just practically, how do we use and how do we teach and take people on the journey, not just say, hey, here's this thing that we do, and they're not connected to it, or they never wrestled with it. And I think it's such a good just opportunity for us as a church, just to have an exercise to learn and to engage and to journey and to let things come out and just deal with the messiness of it. I think that, as you were saying in the beginning, I think there's some beauty in that, rather than just kind of I want to fast track that process and get to just the symbol that might not have really any meaning because you didn't actually journey through it.
I was thinking of like, how often at least in my context, how often do churches talk about how grateful they are for the facilities that they have, right? Recently, Lennet, as you know, their church burned their mortgage. We just did that 2 weeks ago at our church. We talk about, how great it is to have this facility. Doing a land acknowledgement is just going a couple of feet down from your foundation and saying, I'm actually grateful for the land that this whole thing is sitting on and is sustaining us, as well as the people that have sustained this place for thousands of years.
Oh, that's good. That's a good word.
Yeah, that is a good word. Before we get into the rapid fire round, Danny, I want to give you the last word. Are there any words of encouragement or exhortation that you have for our church community?
I was just going to say thank you for not bringing up CRT.
I was close, man. I was close. That's going to be a whole nother episode. I was gonna, because it is a relevant thing in terms of systemic racism, because again, there's always these like, trying to find these catch-all boogeyman arguments to not deal with what needs to be dealt with as a way to excuse it or to dismiss it, and to not really wrestle with what is being said. But
that's right.
That is going to be a topic of conversation. We might have to have you back on for that one. But but yeah, no, it was there, but I didn't want to open that can of worms today.
We'll start slowly. It's a slow process, we just said, right?
That's right.
All right, Danny. So we got a few rapid fire, this or that type of questions.
Okay.
We tried to find ones that wouldn't be too controversial, but you never know. In this day and age, everything is controversial. So the first one, this kind of comes out of like a previous recording where I was shocked at the response. So I'm curious, Danny. You don't have to be on my side or the other side. But would you say you put your cups right side up or upside down in your cupboard?
Down. No, sorry. Water cups go down and coffee cups go up.
Okay.
Interesting.
I don't necessarily know why.
Okay.
No one knows why. Nobody knows why.
Okay, next one is logos or concordance?
Logos. All the way.
I said it wrong too. Logos.
I do love accordance, and I started with accordance, but migrated over to Logos about probably 10 years ago now, 12 years ago now. And they're both great programs, but I live in Logos now.
All right.
It's always open. It's always open on my computer. It's open right now.
All right, the next one, drum or guitar?
I like them both. I play guitar. I'm only good at hand drum. Single beat. Once you put me with multiples, I can't do that. I can do djembe okay, and I could do a cajon okay.
Oh, okay.
But more
What's
than
the
that,
cajon?
cajon is the box drum you sit on top of. That's a cajon.
Yeah.
Yeah. My
Nice.
2 sons, Hudson's only 6, but he's already getting pretty good at drums for his age, and my son Jack is a very good drummer.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I always found that one hard to wrap my mind around.
Yeah.
All the different things your hands have to do.
Yeah, I know. I can't do it.
All right. So the next one, preaching or lectures?
I would say probably my preaching is like a lecture. Most people say that, so I'd say lecturing.
Just the way your mind works, right?
Yeah, I mean, I try to be interactive and interesting and all that stuff, but yeah, it's slightly different preaching over teaching for sure. So I'd be more of a teacher than a preacher. Yeah.
Nice. The next one is kind of like to your app tech background. So would you rather confess to your boss after a crash that there were no backups, or make daily backups on USB sticks?
Oh, I'd probably rather confess. USB sticks, that would be a nightmare to have to handle all that. How come you didn't have a cloud option in that?
Yeah. It's gotta be hard, right?
Back up on the cloud.
Yeah, we gotta evolve our questions.
USB stick.
No, like that's the whole point.
The last time I used the USB stick.
That's the whole point. That it's like so hard to do.
Yeah.
All right. Are you a computer games or board games fan?
Board games.
Oh.
What's your favorite?
I love Dominion, and just recently been playing Settlers quite a bit with my kids. Yeah.
Yeah, you and Deb will get along, Danny.
I know.
Yeah.
Are you the type of dad that will monopolize after everyone's gotten wheat, for example? Would you do that? Would you play that card?
Yes, of course.
Ruthless.
Who wouldn't?
It's not friends, it's business.
Yeah, that's right.
That's amazing.
Not family during those times.
All right, the last one, it might get dated once this releases, but I'm curious. Would you say there are more doors or more wheels in the world?
It's got to be wheels. I would say
right.
It's gotta be wheels. Yeah.
Danny has spoken.
Well, you think of like trucks, all the trucks in the world. Yeah, in all the convoys going on.
Yeah, that's right.
The amount of wheels on those things, only 2 doors, 3 doors, and 18 wheels, right?
Yeah, that's good math. That's a good. We're gonna leave you with a cliffhanger. We're not gonna tell you the answer.
I don't think there is an answer. There's just a debate right now. And just to watch people debate it is very fascinating.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm gonna Google it. As soon as we're done, I'm gonna Google it.
Yeah. See where you land.
Yeah.
Well, Danny, we thank you so much, man, for taking the time to be at the same table with us. Yeah. Your insight and your heart and just your wisdom and just sharing where you're at on your journey has been so helpful. I love that you are compassionate and caring and have a shepherding heart, but also very much speak on the side of truth and on the side of the gospel, which is such a beautiful blending of kind of that truth and grace that we see in Jesus. I think you embody that so well and are such a great voice in the issue of trying to see real reconciliation in our world and our society and our churches, and how we can meaningfully address the issue of systemic racism. You keep on journeying that. We thank you again so much for joining us today. This is episode 3 of the Same Table podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you back here for our next episode. Peace.
Hey, thanks for hanging with us at the Same Table, a Deepwater Church podcast. To learn more about who we are, where we are, resources we offer, and ways to get involved, go to deepwaterchurch.com. The Same Table podcast is produced by Matthew Thomas and Deb Wong. Technical production by Sam Prime and Jeff Fifield. Drop us a note if you have any questions or encouraging words at info@deepwaterchurch.com.